Let's be honest. I think we're all ready for the 2024 presidential election to be over and done with. Constant ads bombarding our TVs and phones, a 24/7 news cycle that can't seem to focus on anything else. It's got the pomp and pageantry of the Super Bowl, but without any of the fun. Instead, there's just a feeling of existential dread, like the fate of the world hangs in the balance. And one thing is for sure, after all the ballots have been counted and the result is finalized, millions of people will feel relieved, while millions of others will feel deeply distraught. But why? Why does this single event have a collective psychological grasp on so many of us? In theory, if a democratic governing body is completely reflective of the will of the people, then elections should feel like low-stakes affairs, a simple taking of the temperature as we go on living our normal lives. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like an event with a capital E. It feels like the Super Bowl with stakes. So how did we get here? I believe it's a convergence of a few different factors. Some of them having to do with how elections are run, some of them having to do with our modern media landscape, and some of them simply being a reflection of our current political climate. It's a lot to try to unpack, but we're going to try nevertheless. Let's dive in. First things first, let's look at the way that our elections are set up, specifically as it pertains to the presidency. As you probably already know, each state gets a set number of electoral college votes based on their population. To become the president, you need to win the majority of these electoral college votes. This majority requirement naturally results in two major parties arising to challenge for the presidency. Sure, there are smaller factions that exist within each party, but they band together because they understand that, realistically, they have two choices for president, and they'd rather see the choice that they more closely align with win. It's not just the fault of the Electoral College that we have a two-party system, though. It's also due to an absence of ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting allows voters to rank their desired candidates in order instead of having to pick just one. Implementing this capability would alleviate the fear of wasting a vote that many voters currently have when it comes to picking a third-party candidate. If voters prefer a third-party candidate to the major party choices, they can rank their third-party candidate first and their major party choice second. That way, they can support their third-party choice without potentially spoiling the race for their preferred major party candidate. If every voter had this option, perhaps more third-party candidates would win elections, thus leading to greater diversity of thought in government. But it's not the case, at least not right now. And thus, this two-party dominance trickles down all the way from the highest office in the land to small local races. And while our two-party system is not the sole reason that elections have this do-or-die feel, it is the core issue. It results in a black and white, us versus them mentality that is held by a large portion of our nation's voters. So the stage is set. One team prepared to do battle against another and a no-holds-barred winner-takes-all contest. But the Super Bowl isn't just the Super Bowl because you have two teams competing against each other for supremacy. It's the Super Bowl because of the spectacle and the narratives surrounding it. The weeks of non-stop coverage analyzing the teams and building the stakes. Sound familiar? This marketing philosophy has been copied and pasted from sports into politics, making every election feel just as much an entertainment affair as it does an event with actual consequences. And the team-based mentality that has naturally sprung up from the operation of our elections is preyed upon and exacerbated by our modern media landscape, perhaps most obviously in the realm of cable news. Cable news networks, which have largely always delivered news in a partisan slant due to their lack of regulation by the FCC, have only gotten more partisan and more polarizing over the past decade. They've found a winning formula in catering news and opinions that will only serve to reaffirm the perspectives of their partisan viewers. And I'm not blaming the viewers here. They're victims of a two-party system which has enabled them to look at politics in a black and white manner. Of course, online news and social media have only worsened this echo chamber problem. We've become a country that, politically speaking, sometimes seems to live in two separate realities completely divorced from each other. So it's no wonder that the election would feel so high stakes. We've been taught to feel as if folks who live in a different reality from us are electing politicians who make decisions that will affect us too. Speaking of decisions, one of the most important decisions a president has the power to make is the appointment of a Supreme Court judge. Holding an unelected, lifetime position on the highest court in the land, these justices have the power to shape American life for decades. And with a deeper sense of partisanship in our politics, these already powerful Supreme Court picks are made to feel all the more important. Having appointed 3 justices in 4 years, perhaps the most consequential one-term president when it comes to Supreme Court picks is Donald Trump. And his role in this election feeling as high stakes and divisive as it does deserves a category of its own. Donald Trump is a political anomaly. There's no other way to say it. His ability to speak to the needs and stoke the fears of his political base is unmatched. It's what's allowed him to reshape the Republican Party into his mold and avoid playing by the traditional rules of the political game. Scandals that would have sunk previous political campaigns have been like water off a duck's back for Donald Trump. There are many examples of this, but perhaps the clearest of them all is the January 6th riot and his continued denial of the 2020 presidential election results. The distrust that Trump sowed into the election process leading up to, during, and after January 6th, 2021 would be absolutely disqualifying for any prior candidate in recent memory. Sure, there would be that small circle of hardcore supporters that would stick by their guy, but the vast majority of the electorate would disavow and move on. Not with Trump, though. His circle of ardent followers is frankly larger than it's been for previous candidates, thus allowing him to be somewhat politically bulletproof. But that's not without its cost. Along with his large, fervent fan base comes an equally large group of passionate detractors that heartily believe a second Trump presidency is not in the best interest of the American people. He may refer to his political opponents as the enemy within and talk about how the Democrats' policies are so radical that the only way they could win the election is by cheating, but that just makes his detractors all the more convinced that he's unfit to be president and all the more likely to vote against him in the upcoming election. This, of course, causes Trump supporters to become even more steeped in their MAGA footing. It's a vicious cycle that Trump either doesn't know how or doesn't care to stop. Whatever the case, it has resulted in a set of contentious presidential elections over the past 8 years, and the conclusion to the trilogy looks to be the most contentious yet. When I made that point earlier about how elections should feel like low-stakes affairs, a simple taking of the temperature before we go back to living our daily lives, I wasn't speaking from a place of pie-in-the-sky naivete. We saw it happen earlier this year in the UK, where the general election was announced 5 weeks before it took place. A British colleague of mine didn't even know the election was taking place. Can you imagine somebody in America not knowing that the presidential election is coming up? I'm not saying blissful ignorance is the answer, but it'd be nice if these elections didn't feel so damn momentous and consequential. We've got a long way to go before we get there, though. I haven't even mentioned the amount of money that's been pumped into these election campaigns. For context, the entire Labour Party, the overall winners of the UK general election, raised about £9.5 million, roughly equivalent to $12.3 million. Meanwhile, both Harris and Trump have raised over $1 billion for their respective campaigns. When there is this much money involved, it's no wonder the election feels so high stakes. So what can we do about it? Well, we can pass campaign finance reform laws to limit the amount of money that flows into our elections. We can introduce ranked choice voting to give third-party candidates a better shot and hopefully cut down on the political polarization. And we can avoid partisan news sources that just tell us what we want to hear with no critical thinking required. I suppose it also wouldn't hurt to elect candidates that represent the values and integrity that we want to see. These are no small tasks, but it's worth the effort. I know that I personally would like to get to a point where I can drop my ballot off and go on with my life, knowing no matter the outcome of the election, things are going to be all right, and we'll get where we're going together. Hopefully you feel the same way too. Thanks for watching.